I never thought she'd hate me. And not calling on my birthday, it just broke me.
She didn't show up to my birthday. She didn't call on Mother's Day. And when I finally texted her, she blocked me. My own daughter. The child I almost died giving birth to. I didn't abuse her. I didn't abandon her. I loved her more than I have ever loved anything in this world. So what happened? Every year, millions of American parents are cut off by their own adult children, and most of them never find out why. Tonight we are going inside the silent epidemic tearing families apart. And if you are a mother watching this, you may already know exactly what I am talking about. Stay with us, because what we discovered about why this happens and what you can actually do about it is going to change how you see everything. There is a particular kind of grief that the English language does not have a word for. It is not the grief of losing someone to death, because death at least carries the mercy of finality. The casseroles that appear at your door, the funeral where people say the name out loud, the permission the world gives you to fall apart in public. It is not the grief of a divorce either, because a divorce arrives with paperwork and a date you can point to and say, that is where it ended. This grief is something else entirely. It lives in the space between a ringing phone and a voicemail that never fills up. It lives in the birthday cards that come back unopened, and in the holiday table set for people who do not come, and in the grandmother who sits in the church pew on Mother's Day and smiles when the pastor asks all the mothers to stand, because she has learned, slowly and at great cost, to smile in public about the thing that is taking her apart in private. This is the grief of a mother whose living, breathing, adult child has chosen to vanish from her life. And it is one of the most devastating things a human being can endure and survive. Her name is Margaret Ellen Calloway, 61 years old, a retired nurse from a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. If you had passed her on the street in the summer of 2021, you would have seen a woman with silver-streaked hair and a wide, unhurried smile. The kind of woman who remembers your name after one introduction, who brings food to sick neighbors without being asked, who keeps a vegetable garden in her backyard that she tends with the patience of someone who genuinely believes that what you put into the earth, you will eventually get back. You would not have seen the grief she was carrying. You would not have known, looking at her, that she had not spoken to her daughter in 6 months, that her calls went straight to voicemail, that her texts delivered but were never read, that on the morning her daughter's birthday passed without a single returned message. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and stayed there for 4 hours, because her body did not know where else to go. Margaret had 3 children. Daniel, the oldest, who had built a quiet life 2 hours north with his wife and their twin boys. Cody, the youngest, who had stayed close in the way youngest children sometimes do. Still calling on Sundays, still showing up for the holidays, still the one who remembered to ask how her knee was doing after the surgery. And then there was Claire Marie Calloway, 34 years old when this story begins, with her mother's eyes and her late father's stubbornness and a laugh that Margaret has described, more than once, as the most beautiful sound she has ever heard in her life. Claire was the middle child, the sensitive one, the one who felt everything more deeply than the world around her seemed designed to accommodate. And Claire was the one who, somewhere between the fall of 2019 and the winter of 2021, became a stranger. Margaret was born in 1960 in Zanesville, Ohio, the second of 4 children raised by a father who worked the line at a ceramic tile factory and a mother named Ruth who cleaned other people's houses 3 days a week and called it helping out, even though without that money the family would not have eaten. They were not a family that talked about feelings. They were a family that endured. When something broke in that household, an appliance, a relationship, a heart, you fixed it as quietly as you could. You did not bring it up at dinner, and you did not burden other people with the weight of it. Margaret's mother, Ruth, was not a cruel woman. She was simply a woman who had been raised to believe that love was something you demonstrated through sacrifice and consistency, not through words, and that the highest compliment a mother could pay her child was to say, without further elaboration, that the child had not given her any trouble. Margaret grew up believing that was the full measure of good mothering. She would spend the next 4 decades discovering, slowly and painfully and at enormous cost, that it was not the whole truth at all. She met Gary Calloway in the fall of 1982 at a community college in Columbus, where they were both taking accounting classes that neither of them would ever use professionally. Gary was funny in the way that quiet men sometimes are, unexpectedly, precisely, with a timing that caught you off guard and made you feel, for a moment, like you had been let in on something. They married in 1984. Margaret was 24 years old. She wore a dress her mother helped her sew because the ones in the bridal shop windows were beyond what the family budget could reach, and she stood at the altar in a church that smelled of old wood and Easter lilies, and she made promises she fully intended to keep. Daniel came first in 1986. Cody arrived in 1993, and Claire Marie, came in the spring of 1989, 2 weeks early and screaming, the way Claire would do most things throughout her life, ahead of schedule and with enormous feeling. Margaret would say years later that Claire announced herself to the world before the world was entirely ready for her. She was not wrong about that. The early years of the Calloway family looked, from the outside, exactly like what they were supposed to look like. Gary worked in facilities management for the county. Margaret worked part-time as a nurse's aide at a long-term care facility, fitting her shifts around school pickups and soccer practices and the thousand small logistical demands of raising 3 children in a house with 1 bathroom and a furnace that needed replacing every other winter. They were not wealthy. They were not struggling in the way that keeps parents awake with real fear at 3 in the morning. They were somewhere in the particular American middle where you work hard and love your children fiercely and hope that those 2 things together will be sufficient. For a long time, watching the children grow, Margaret genuinely believed they were. She believed it the way you believe in the ground beneath your feet, without examining it, because it has always held. Claire was the child who first complicated that belief, and she did it not in ways that alarmed Margaret at the time, not in ways that would have registered on any external scale as trouble, but in ways that persisted and accumulated and became, over years, a pattern neither of them could entirely name. Claire felt things with an intensity that the rest of the Calloway family, practical, stoic, Midwestern to the marrow, did not entirely know what to do with. She cried at commercials. She brought home stray animals and wept when Margaret said they could not keep them. She filled journal after journal from the time she was 8 years old with the kind of introspective, searching observations that children twice her age rarely produce. She was, in the word that teachers kept reaching for in parent-teacher conferences, sensitive. And in the Calloway household, sensitive was not a quality to be honored. It was a vulnerability that good parenting was supposed to help a child work through and overcome. It was something you managed, something you did not let get the better of you. That belief, held by Margaret with genuine love and complete sincerity, was one of the first fault lines running beneath the surface of their relationship. Neither of them knew it was there. Gary left in the spring of 2001. Claire was 12 years old. It did not happen the way these things happen in movies. There was no screaming, no broken dishes, no dramatic departure. Gary sat Margaret down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while the children were still at school and told her, with a quietness that was almost worse than anger, that he had not been happy for a long time and that he believed it would be better for everyone if he moved out. Margaret sat across from him and felt something leave her body that she spent years afterward trying to name and never quite could. Not love. The love had been complicated for a long time. Something more like the future. Something like the version of herself she had been slowly building toward, in the direction of a life that made a certain kind of sense. The divorce was finalized the following spring. Daniel was 15 and handled it with the Calloway family's trademark stoicism, burying whatever he actually felt under a football scholarship and a personality that grew louder and more social the more he needed to not think about something. Cody was 8 and too young to fully understand what had changed, knowing only that his father's things were gone and that his mother sometimes cried in the bathroom at night when she thought the children were asleep. And Claire, 12-year-old Claire, the one who felt everything twice as deeply as the world intended, understood exactly what had happened and had absolutely no language for what it was doing to her. She started writing in her journals more. She started watching her mother with the particular, careful attention of a child who has just learned that the people she depends on most are capable of disappearing without warning. Margaret threw herself into surviving, which is the only accurate word for what the years between 2001 and 2010 looked like from inside that house. She picked up more shifts at the nursing facility. She joined the church deacon board because the community held her and because being needed somewhere outside the house helped her get out of bed in the mornings. She made sure there was food on the table and the bills were paid, and Daniel got to his practices, and Cody had clean uniforms for school, and Claire had everything she needed in every material sense, everything that Margaret's own mother would have pointed to as evidence of excellent mothering. What she did not have enough to give, in those years of pure survival, was sustained emotional presence. She did not have it because no one had ever given it to her, so she did not know precisely what it looked like from the inside of a relationship. She did not have it because exhaustion is its own kind of wall between a parent and a child. And she did not have it because Claire, who needed it most, had learned by watching her parents to keep the deepest things sealed behind a closed door. And so the two of them lived in the same house, loving each other genuinely and missing each other profoundly, without either one of them fully understanding that the missing was already happening. Claire left for Ohio State in the fall of 2007 and came back changed in the small, accumulating ways that college changes people, with new opinions, new vocabulary, new friends whose names Margaret could never quite keep straight, and a growing, quiet sense of herself as a person separate from the family she came from. That was normal. Margaret understood it as normal. What she did not understand, what she would not understand for years, not until she was sitting in a therapist's office at 61 years old for the very first time, was that college was also where Claire began finding language for things she had felt her entire life but had never been given permission to name. She took a psychology course her sophomore year that opened a door she had not known existed. She had a roommate named Destiny who had grown up in a family where people talked openly about what they were feeling, where the phrase "that hurt me" was treated as useful information rather than weakness, and that roommate became Claire's first real window into what a family could look like when the people inside it were actually allowed to speak honestly and be heard without the conversation immediately turning towards someone else's greater pain. Not everything Claire concluded through that window was fair to Margaret. Not all of it was accurate or complete, but all of it was real to Claire. And real is what matters when you are 20 years old and deciding, slowly and without quite realizing you are making a decision, what you are willing to carry forward and what you are going to have to put down. By the time Claire graduated in 2011 and moved to Cincinnati for a marketing position, 2 hours from Columbus, the fault lines that had been forming for years had not yet broken the surface. Margaret told herself the distance was normal and meant it, and largely believed it. Claire came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and she was warm when she came, and Margaret cooked the things Claire had loved as a child: the green bean casserole, the sweet potato pie, the cornbread from the recipe card in her mother's handwriting. And they sat together, and the conversation moved the way family conversation moves when everyone has agreed, without discussing it, to stay on the safe surfaces. And Margaret held her daughter's hand sometimes across the table in those moments and felt, holding it, that everything was still fundamentally intact. Because that is what mothers do when the alternative is too large to look at directly. They take whatever evidence is available and they build the best possible case from it. It was around 2014 that Claire started therapy. She mentioned it to Margaret in passing. The way you mention something you expect will land strangely, quickly, without making eye contact, moving on before the other person can fully formulate a response. She was seeing someone, she said, because work had been stressful, because of anxiety. Margaret said that sounded like a good idea and genuinely meant it, and did not ask any further questions, because in the world Margaret had been raised in, therapy was something you did for a specific identifiable crisis, and when the crisis resolved, so did the therapy. She did not understand, in 2014, that Claire was not in therapy for a work problem. She was in therapy because she had spent 25 years carrying things she had never been given permission to put down, and she had finally found a room where she was allowed to open her hands and look at what was in them. Claire did not cut Margaret off in 2014. She did not cut her off in 2015 or 2016 or 2017 either. What she did across those years was begin a series of conversations that Margaret experienced as attacks and that Claire experienced as attempts at honesty. And the distance between those two experiences of the same moments was so vast that neither of them could see across it. The first conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon in October 2015, during a visit home for Cody's birthday. The other guests had gone. Margaret was washing dishes at the sink when Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, quietly and carefully, in the voice of someone who has been rehearsing, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen without responding right away." Margaret dried her hands. She turned around. She looked at her daughter standing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest the way Claire had always stood when she was bracing for something. And she said she was listening. What Claire said, standing in that doorway, was that she had been working in therapy on her childhood, and that there were things she needed her mother to hear. She said that growing up she had often felt like her feelings were not taken seriously, that when she cried she was told to stop, that when she was sad she was redirected toward gratitude, that when she tried to talk about something that was hurting her, the conversation would shift somehow, and she would end up comforting her mother instead of being comforted, listening to how hard Margaret had worked, what Margaret had sacrificed, what the family had been through, until Claire stopped trying to explain her own pain because the explanation always became about someone else's. She said she did not think her mother had done any of this on purpose. She said she loved her, and then she waited. Margaret heard every word. But what was happening inside her while she listened was not the open, receptive attention that Claire needed from her in that moment. What was happening inside Margaret was the particular internal storm of a person who loves deeply and has just been told that the love was not enough, and who does not have the tools to sit with that information without immediately defending against it. She told Claire she was sorry she felt that way. She told Claire she had done her best. She told her about the divorce, about the double shifts, about the years she had held the family together alone. And Claire, standing in the doorway of her mother's kitchen at 26 years old, heard every one of those words as confirmation of exactly what she had just described. The conversation had turned. It was about Margaret's pain now, and Claire went quiet in the way people go quiet when they have tried the door and found it locked. Not with a slam, not with anger, but with the small, permanent sound of someone deciding not to try that door again. That conversation did not end their relationship, but it changed something between them that could not be unchanged. It established a pattern that would repeat itself with small variations across the next 3 years. Claire attempting to be heard, Margaret responding from a place of love and fear and defensiveness that she genuinely believed was honesty, and the distance between them growing by increments so small that neither of them could have measured the change in any given month, but that accumulated, over years, into something wide and cold. Claire tried. She tried more than once and more than twice. She tried in phone calls that ended with Margaret crying about how hard she had worked. She tried in a letter she mailed in 2017 that Margaret received and responded to with a letter of her own that addressed every point Claire had raised by explaining why Claire had misremembered. She tried the way adult children try when they love their parent and cannot make peace with the idea of giving up, until the trying itself becomes a cost they can no longer afford to keep paying. By 2018, the calls had fallen to once every few weeks. The visits had shrunk to twice a year. And Claire, in the private spaces of her own life, had begun making a decision she had not yet fully spoken out loud, even to herself. That spring she started dating a man named Trevor. Trevor was a quiet, steady, emotionally present man who worked as a physical therapist in Cincinnati and who had grown up in a family where people said what they felt and then worked through the consequences together, without anyone having to manage anyone else's reaction before speaking. Claire loved him quickly and with the specific relief of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been told they are allowed to exhale. Margaret met Trevor at Thanksgiving 2018, and her reaction to him was complicated in ways she did not examine closely enough at the time. She found him pleasant but quiet in a way that unsettled her. She noticed the private language between him and Claire, the shorthand of glances and half-finished sentences that excluded everyone else in the room, and she felt excluded by it in a way she could not entirely name, but also could not set aside. And she noticed, though she would not have put it in these terms, that Claire seemed more fully herself around Trevor than she had seemed in years in her mother's presence. She laughed differently. She took up more space. She was less careful. That observation, the one that should have told Margaret something important about what her daughter needed, made Margaret afraid instead. And fear, in the Calloway family, had always found its way out through control. The Christmas of 2018 was the last one Claire attended at the family home. Late in the evening, after the dishes were done and the rest of the family had moved to other rooms, Margaret and Claire ended up alone in the kitchen together. Margaret had had 2 glasses of wine, which was one more than usual, and she said something. She has given different accounts of exactly what over the years, in the way memory quietly revises our worst moments, something about Trevor, something about how Claire had seemed changed since she started seeing him, something that came from a genuine place of love and an equally genuine place of fear about losing her daughter, but that landed the way things land when they are spoken without any filter for what the other person actually needs to receive. Claire went very still. She said, with a quietness that Margaret would later describe as the most frightening thing she had ever heard from another human being, "Mom, I need you to stop." And Margaret, who had never known how to stop when she was afraid of losing something, kept talking. And Claire, without another word, walked out of the kitchen, went upstairs to the guest room, and was gone from the house before Margaret's alarm went off the following morning. That was the last time they were in the same room together. Not because of what was said that one night in the kitchen specifically, but because that night was a confirmation. The moment Claire felt, in her bones, that nothing between them was ever going to change unless something fundamental shifted, and that the shifting was not something she could do for her mother. It had to come from Margaret herself. And across the 13 months between that Christmas and the February morning when the text arrived, Claire made the decision the way decisions of this magnitude are always made. Not in a single flash of anger, not impulsively, not on the advice of a stranger online, but with the slow, exhausted finality of someone who has tried every other door and found them all closed. The text arrived on a Wednesday morning in February 2021. Margaret was at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched when her phone lit up with Claire's name. The message read, "Mom, I love you, but being around you makes me feel small. I need space to figure out who I am without your voice in my head. Please don't call me. I'll reach out when I'm ready." Margaret read it once, then again, then a third time. She called Claire's number, and it went to voicemail. She called again, voicemail again. She sent a text back and watched it deliver, and then watched the screen for a long time, waiting for the 2 small check marks that would tell her it had been read, and they never came. By the following morning, she had been blocked on every platform her daughter owned. The calls, the messages, all of it. A silence as complete and terrible as the silence after a car accident, when the world goes suddenly still and you do not yet know the full extent of what has been lost. Margaret spent the first weeks after the text in a state she could only describe, later, as a disbelief so total it felt almost like calm. She went to work. She watered the garden. She sat in church on Sundays and sang the hymns she had been singing since she was a girl, and felt the familiar weight of the congregation around her, and wondered if anyone looking at her could see that she was dissolving from the inside. She told Daniel, who called Claire's behavior unacceptable and said their sister had always been dramatic and promised to talk to her. She told her sister Barbara, who said it would blow over. She told her pastor, who prayed with her and said God had a plan. And none of those responses, offered in genuine love by people who genuinely cared, touched the thing that was happening inside Margaret. Because the thing that was happening inside Margaret was not a problem any of those responses were designed to address. What Margaret needed was not reassurance that she was right. She needed someone to help her understand what was true. She made 3 mistakes in those first 6 months, and she made all of them out of love, and none of them helped. She called Daniel, and Daniel called Claire, and that call did not bring Claire closer. It brought her to Cody instead, and what Cody heard from his sister in that phone call was a version of the family history he had not previously known existed in full. And suddenly Cody, who had always been the one person in the Calloway family capable of loving everyone without requiring any of them to be other than they were, found himself standing in the middle of something he had not asked to be part of, asked to choose a side in a conflict that had been building since before he was old enough to understand it. The damage that single phone call caused to what remained of the family's fragile web would take years to begin to repair. The second mistake was the letter. Margaret sat down in May of 2021 and wrote Claire a letter 12 pages long on the yellow legal pads she kept in the kitchen drawer. And it was not a cruel letter. It was in many ways a beautiful letter, full of the specific memories and the particular texture of 34 years of a mother's love for a child she had known since before the child knew herself. But it was also, underneath all of that beauty, a letter of defense. A letter that explained and justified and asked Claire to reconsider what she had said she felt, because Margaret could not write a letter without defending herself in it, because defending herself was the only tool she had been given for this kind of pain. Claire received it. She read it. She recognized in it the same pattern she had described standing in the kitchen doorway in 2015. She did not respond. The third mistake was the drive to Cincinnati. On a Saturday morning in July 2021, Margaret got in her car at 6 in the morning without calling ahead because there was no number left to call, and drove the 2 hours to the apartment building where Claire lived and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before going up to the third floor and knocking on the door. Claire answered in her pajamas. Trevor was somewhere in the apartment behind her. Claire looked at her mother standing in the hallway, and her face did something complicated. Not cold, not angry, but the expression of a person who has just seen confirmed the very thing they had been hoping would not be confirmed. She said, "Mom, you can't do this." Margaret said she needed to talk. Claire said she understood and she was sorry, but she had asked for space and she needed Margaret to respect it. And Margaret, operating entirely from the terror of losing her daughter, said the words that would replay in her own head for the next 2 years. "I don't understand why I have to respect something that is hurting me this much." And Claire, without another word, closed the door. Margaret sat in the parking lot for another hour before she started the car. She cried the entire drive back to Columbus. Not the kind of crying that releases something, but the kind that compounds it, that leaves you emptier when it is finished than you were before it began. She did not know, on that highway with her hands on the wheel and her eyes barely dry enough to see the road, that she was about to enter the most important period of her own life. She did not know that the road back to Claire would first require a long and honest journey toward herself. She only knew she had driven 200 miles and knocked on a door and been turned away, and she had never in 61 years of living felt more alone or more lost. She tried church, and it held her in the way community holds people, but it did not answer the question living in her chest every morning when she woke up. She tried talking to Barbara and to her pastor and to Daniel, and their love was real and their responses were useless because they were all, in their own ways, telling her she was right and what Margaret needed, though she could not yet name it, was something closer to the truth. It was Cody who eventually said the thing that cracked something open. He said it at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in October 2021, quietly, in the way he had always delivered difficult things, not as an accusation, but as a careful offering from a man who loved his mother and could not watch her stay stuck any longer. He said, "Mom, I think you need to talk to someone who is not in this family." Margaret looked at her youngest son across the table, and she thought about how much it must have cost him to say that out loud. And she thought about the fact that he had said it anyway because he loved her enough to. 3 weeks later, she called a therapist. The therapist's name was Dr. Sandra Reeves, a family counselor in Columbus who had spent 20 years working with what she called intergenerational fractures, the breaks in families that look, from the outside, like one person's decision, but are almost always the result of decades of smaller, quieter, unacknowledged distances. Margaret sat across from her at the first appointment with her coat still on and her purse in her lap, and said, before Dr. Reeves could say anything at all, "I want you to know that I was a good mother. I worked 2 jobs. I held the family together after the divorce. I did not abuse my children. I did not neglect them. I need you to know that before we start." Dr. Reeves looked at her for a moment and then said, gently and without any performance of gentleness, "I hear you, and I believe you. And I also think that if we spend our time here proving that, we are not going to get very far." That sentence, that single, quiet, honest sentence, was the first thing anyone had said to Margaret in the 9 months since the text that was actually true about where she was standing and what she needed to do next. What Margaret discovered in Dr. Reeves's office across the following months was not that she was a bad mother. She was not a bad mother. What she discovered was that she was a human being who had been given a very particular set of tools for building relationships, tools she had inherited from Ruth, who had inherited them from her own mother before that, and that some of those tools had built something real and warm and lasting, and some of them had built things that looked like closeness from the outside but functioned, from the inside, like walls. She learned, for the first time at 61 years old, the difference between listening and simply waiting for her turn to speak. She learned what it costs a child to need something from a parent and receive instead a detailed accounting of the parent's own suffering. She learned that the phrase "I'm sorry you feel that way" is not an apology. It is a door closing while appearing to open. And she learned that the version of herself she had been defending since February 2021, the good mother, the hardworking woman, the woman who had done her best, was real, and was also incomplete. Because she had done her best. And her best had included blind spots. And Claire had lived inside those blind spots for 30 years. And it was possible. It was more than possible. It was simply true. That both of those things could exist at the same time, without one of them canceling the other out. Margaret joined a support group for estranged parents that met on Thursday evenings in the basement of a Methodist church in Columbus. 8 women and 2 men sitting in folding chairs with bad coffee and the specific relief of a room where no one expected you to say it was fine. She found in that room something she had not had since the morning the text arrived. The particular comfort of being understood by people who were living inside the same dark. She found women who had been waiting for 7 years, and women who had been waiting for 2, and women who had stopped waiting and built a different kind of life in the space their children had left. Not a smaller life, but a life oriented around what was still present rather than what was absent. She found, sitting in those folding chairs on Thursday evenings, a version of forward motion that did not require resolution to be real. She spent 4 months writing the letter. Not the 12-page letter from May, the defensive one, the one that was really a court filing dressed as a mother's plea. This was a different kind of letter entirely. Dr. Reeves had told her, and she had resisted the instruction with everything she had before she finally accepted it, that the letter needed to do one thing only. It needed to acknowledge Claire's experience without qualifying it, without explaining it, without the word but appearing anywhere in it at all. It needed to say, in language simple enough to be believed, I hear you. I see you now. I am sorry. Not I'm sorry you feel that way. Not I'm sorry, but you need to understand what I was going through. Just the plain, undefended words. I am sorry. I see now that I did not always make enough room for your pain. I see now that I sometimes made your pain about mine without knowing I was doing it. I am not asking you for anything. I am not asking you to come back or to call or to forgive me on any timeline. I just needed you to know that I heard you, finally, and that I love you without condition, and that whenever and however you are ready, I am here. She mailed it on a Thursday morning in March 2022. She drove to the post office herself rather than dropping it in the mailbox outside her house, because she wanted the act of sending it to feel like the deliberate, irreversible thing it was. She stood at the counter and handed the envelope to the clerk and watched it disappear behind the window, and drove home and sat in the garden for a long time, not crying, just breathing, holding in both hands at once the possibility that Claire would call and the possibility that she never would, and trying to be genuinely at peace with both. She was not entirely at peace. She was close enough. For months passed. Then 5. Her birthday came and went without a message. She sat with that. She went to the Thursday group. She kept her appointments with Dr. Reeves. She kept tending the garden, putting things into the earth and waiting, the way she had always done, for what the earth would return. The call came on a Tuesday evening in August 2022. Margaret was in the kitchen making dinner when her phone rang with an Ohio number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. She had learned, across 18 months of silence, to be careful about what she let her heart do with unknown numbers. But she answered, and there was a pause, just long enough for her to consider hanging up, and then she heard a voice she would have known in the dark, in any language, under any circumstances in the world. Claire, calling from a new number, her voice careful and measured in the way of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say and is still not entirely sure they are prepared to say it. She said she had read the letter. She said she had read it many times. And then she said the thing that Margaret cannot repeat, even now, without her voice going quiet first. She said, Mom, I don't hate you. I never hated you. I just needed you to hear me. And I think, maybe, this time, you finally did. They did not fix everything that evening. They talked for 47 minutes carefully, the way people talk when they have learned the cost of carelessness. And they did not resolve everything, and they did not pretend to. And when they hung up, Margaret sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and stayed there for a long time, not crying, just breathing in the slow, deliberate way of someone who has just received something they had stopped letting themselves believe in. They began meeting for coffee once a month at a diner on the halfway point between Columbus and Cincinnati, a place neither of them had any history with, neutral ground where they could be 2 people building something new rather than 2 people trying to recover something old. They brought to those meetings a carefulness that looked, from the outside, like a reduced intimacy, but that was, from the inside, something truer and more durable than the closeness they had performed for years. They said hard things. They listened to each other saying them. They did not always get it right, but they were in the room together. They were choosing each other on purpose, with full knowledge of the cost, and that choosing, after everything, was not a small thing. It was, in the only way that mattered, everything. Before we go, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If this story touched something in you tonight, if you recognized Margaret's grief or Claire's exhaustion or the particular silence that lives between two people who love each other and cannot find a way to say it, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The silence around this topic has gone on long enough, and we will be here next time with another story that deserves to be told.